helicopter is flying a routine patrol over dense woodland terrain. The crew has done this route dozens of times. Rolling hills, thick tree cover, broken ground, nothing unusual, nothing that should stop them. But then one of the crew members leans forward. He sees something, a shape that does not belong, a pattern in the trees that is too deliberate, too structured to be natural. He calls it out. The pilot adjusts. They circle back. And what happens next is something none of them will forget for the rest of their lives. Before we go any further, if you are the kind of person who wants to understand what modern warfare actually looks like at the ground level, subscribe right now. The stories we cover here go deeper than the headlines. They go into the moment itself, and this one is about to get very real. So let us go back to the beginning. Let us build this scene from the ground up, because to understand what that helicopter crew found and what happened after, you need to understand the world they were operating in. You need to understand the terrain, the mission, the threat, and the extraordinary skill on both sides of this encounter. Because this is not a simple story about a helicopter finding something and that being the end of it. This is a story about detection, concealment, reaction, training, and the terrifying speed at which a hidden situation can become a life or death confrontation. The environment: picture a landscape that seems almost peaceful from altitude, green canopy stretching in every direction, a river cutting through the lower ground, patches of open fields separated by dense forest, the kind of terrain that looks calm from 500 feet up but is in reality one of the most dangerous operational environments on Earth, because the ground is uneven, the shadows are deep. And anyone who knows what they are doing can disappear into that landscape so completely that even trained eyes will miss them on the first pass, on the second pass, sometimes on the third. Ground forces who build hidden positions, what the military calls fighting positions or hides, are not amateurs. They study the land. They study how light falls across it at different times of day. They study how aerial observers scan, what angles they favor, what speeds they fly, what altitudes they prefer. The people building these positions know that helicopters exist. They plan for them, they account for them, and in some cases, they specifically train to defeat aerial observation. So when a helicopter crew spots one of these positions, it is not luck. It is not random. It is the product of experience, pattern recognition, training, and the kind of focused attention that only comes from doing this repeatedly in real environments under real conditions. The crew that spotted this position was not flying casually. They were working. Every single second of that flight, someone on that aircraft was scanning, looking not for obvious things but for the subtle things. The things that take years to learn how to see. And they saw one? Let us talk about what a hidden position actually looks like from the air, because most people have never thought about this in any detail, and the detail matters enormously here. A well-constructed fighting position is designed to defeat observation from multiple angles simultaneously. From the ground, it uses natural cover and concealment. Rocks, vegetation, fallen trees, terrain folds. From the air, the challenge is different. The enemy observer is looking down at a fixed angle and moving, so the position is camouflaged with overhead cover, netting, cut vegetation, local materials that match the surrounding terrain in color, texture, and density. The goal is to make the position look like it was always part of the landscape, like there is nothing there, like nobody made a decision to put anything in that specific spot. And when it is done well, it works. Even experienced aircrews fly over well-built positions and see nothing. The position blends. The human eye accepts what looks natural and moves on. But nothing is perfect. There is always something: a shadow at the wrong angle, a line that is too straight, a color that is slightly off from the surrounding vegetation, a pattern that is geometrically consistent in a way that nature does not produce. These are the tells. These are the things that experienced aircrews are trained to look for. Not what is there, but what is wrong. Not the position itself, but the evidence that something is trying not to be a position. This crew saw one of those tells, and in the seconds that followed, the dynamic of that entire operational area changed completely. The moment of recognition. The pilot was holding altitude, scanning ahead through the windscreen. The crew chief was on the opposite side, working the same task, different angle, standard procedure: divide the observation area, cover the ground systematically, do not let the eye skip, do not let familiarity with the terrain lead to assumptions about what is and is not there. And then there was a pause in the radio chatter, a beat of silence that anyone who has flown combat missions knows immediately. It is the pause before someone says something that matters, the kind of pause that happens when the brain has processed something but has not quite finished deciding whether to believe what it just saw. The crew member called it out. Position, possible, grid follows. He gave the rough location by reference to a terrain feature, a bend in the tree line, a low ridge that ran east to west, a cleared area that marked one edge of a natural boundary. He described what he had seen, and as he described it, the pilot was already adjusting. They did not make an obvious circle. They did not slow down dramatically. They did not do anything that would signal to anyone on the ground that they had seen something. That discipline, that control in the moment of discovery is itself a product of training. Because the moment a helicopter crew visibly reacts to a sighting, the element of surprise is gone. And on a modern battlefield, surprise is not just a tactical advantage. It is often the difference between everyone coming home and nobody coming home. They continued on their heading for another few seconds. Then the pilot made a gradual course adjustment that looked natural from the ground. A slow arc that brought them back toward the area from a different angle, a different altitude, a slightly different speed. This pass was for confirmation. The first sighting might have been a rock formation, a fallen tree, a shadow. The second pass would answer the question. It answered it. This was not a rock formation, this was not a shadow, this was a hidden position, deliberately constructed, occupied, and the crew now had a decision to make that would shape everything that followed. What they had found, to understand the significance of what the helicopter crew spotted, you need to understand what a properly built and occupied hidden position represents in a tactical environment. This is not just a hole in the ground. This is a planned, resourced, and deliberately placed element of someone's tactical design. Someone chose that specific location. They chose it because of what it could observe, what it could cover, what it could dominate. The position had fields of fire. It had concealed access routes. It had overhead protection against air observation. It had been placed there on purpose by people who knew what they were doing as part of a larger plan. That last part is the critical one. A single hidden position does not exist in isolation. It is part of a network. It is tied to adjacent positions, to command elements, to support elements, to withdrawal routes. Finding one position is significant, but the question that immediately follows is the more dangerous one. What else is out there? Where does this fit? What is the larger picture that this single point represents? And that question creates an immediate and serious operational problem, because the helicopter crew now knows something, but they do not know how much they are known to know. Does the position know it has been compromised? Did anyone on the ground see the helicopter adjust its flight path? Did anyone hear a change in engine note, a shift in altitude, anything that might suggest detection? These questions matter enormously because they shape what happens next. If the position does not know it has been spotted, the tactical advantage sits entirely with the side that spotted it. They can act on the information while the enemy believes themselves secure. They can bring in additional assets, coordinate a response, develop the situation before anyone on the ground realizes the situation has developed. But if the position knows, even suspects, that it has been compromised, then the clock is running, and everyone in that position is now preparing for what comes next. The calculation, the helicopter crew reported upward immediately. This is standard procedure and it is critical. The people in that helicopter have now become, in a sense, the most important observers in that operational area. What they do with the information they have just gathered will shape the next phase of events. So the information goes up the chain fast. Grid coordinates, description of what was observed, confidence level of the observation, time on target. Direction of flight when observation was made, what angle the observation came from, how the crew responded afterward. All of this goes up the chain of command, and the machine of response begins to move. This is where the speed and coordination of modern military operations becomes visible in ways that are not always apparent from the outside. People who have never operated in this environment sometimes imagine military response as a slow, bureaucratic process. Committees, approvals, lengthy deliberations. And in some contexts, in some levels of decision-making, that deliberation is appropriate and necessary. But at the tactical level, when a helicopter crew has just spotted a hidden enemy position in an active operational area, the decision cycle is very fast. It has to be, because the situation is not static. It is developing in real time. Every second that passes is a second in which the people in that position might act, might withdraw, might receive support, might do something that changes the entire calculus of what an appropriate response looks like. So the decision cycle compresses, the information goes up, the assessment is made, the options are evaluated, and a course of action is selected. What those options look like depends on the specifics of the situation, the rules of engagement in effect, the nature of the mission, the presence of civilians in the area, the available assets, the assessed strength and capability of the position, whether this is an isolated element or part of a larger network. All of these factors shape what happens next. But here is what does not change regardless of any of those specifics. The helicopter crew that made this observation is now a critical element of whatever response follows. They have the eyes, they have the picture, they were there, and in many cases they will stay there. Staying on station. One of the most demanding aspects of aerial observation in an environment like this is what happens after the initial sighting. It would be natural, perhaps even rational, to want to get some distance from a location where an armed position has just been identified. That instinct makes perfect human sense. but it runs directly counter to what the mission requires. Because if the helicopter leaves the area, the ground picture goes dark. The command element loses eyes on the target. The position might move, the position might reinforce, the position might receive visitors, and all of that activity, all of that intelligence is lost the moment the aircraft departs. So the crew stays on station. They continue to work the area. They maintain observation on the identified position while simultaneously expanding their scan, looking for additional indicators, additional positions, any activity that suggests this is part of a larger pattern. And they do all of this while managing the reality that the people in that position may well be aware of the helicopter's presence, may well be tracking its movements, and may be making their own calculations about what it represents and what they should do in response. This is the tension that defines aerial observation in a contested environment. The observer is never invisible. A helicopter is loud. It is visible. It occupies a specific piece of airspace that anyone on the ground can see and track. The crew cannot hide the fact that they are there. What they can do is manage their presence, manage their altitude, manage their distance, manage the impression they create. They can try to appear casual, routine, non-specific. Like they are just passing through rather than fixed on a particular point. This is a practice skill, and it requires the same kind of focus and control as the initial observation. Because the moment the helicopter's behavior becomes too obviously focused on a specific location, the element of observation is compromised. The watched know they are being watched, and everything changes. What the ground element sees, now let us shift perspective. Let us go to the ground. Let us look at this situation from the other side, because this is where the story becomes genuinely complex. The people in that hidden position built it for a reason. They chose the location carefully. They invested time and resources in the construction. They understood the risks of aerial detection and they built their concealment accordingly. They believed the position was sound. That belief, that confidence in the concealment shapes their behavior. It shapes what they do when a helicopter approaches. Because a helicopter approaching a well-concealed position that does not know it has been compromised looks different than a helicopter that is actively searching. A helicopter that is just passing through maintains its course, its altitude, its speed. It does not slow, it does not circle, it does not do anything that suggests the crew has seen something specific. So a well-concealed position when a helicopter passes through stays put, stays quiet, stays still. Because the first and most critical rule of concealment is do not move when observed. Movement defeats concealment. A perfectly hidden position that moves when a helicopter is overhead is no longer perfectly hidden. It is a moving shape in a field that was static a moment ago, and moving shapes attract eyes. So the people in that position, if they believe their concealment is intact, will stay exactly where they are. They will wait for the helicopter to move past. They will hold their breath metaphorically and sometimes literally, and they will wait for the sound to fade and the airspace to clear. But if they saw the helicopter adjust, if they saw the approach angle change, if they heard the engine note shift in a way that suggests the crew is maneuvering rather than transiting, if they saw anything that suggested the possibility of detection, then the calculation is completely different. Because now the position has a choice to make, and both options carry risk. If they stay, they might be staying in a location that is about to receive a response. If they move, they break concealment and reveal themselves to any additional observers who may be watching. It is a trap of their own design in a sense. The better the position, the more catastrophically it fails the moment it is compromised, because the people in it cannot easily leave without making themselves more visible than if they had never built it at all. This is the cruel arithmetic of concealment in a modern contested environment. And it is a problem that military planners and individual soldiers have wrestled with for as long as warfare has involved aerial observation. The response builds. Back in the air, back in the command element, the response is taking shape. Additional assets are being tasked. The ground picture is being updated. The grid of the identified position has been distributed to elements that are now beginning to move. Not toward the position directly, not in an obvious way, but in a manner that reduces the distance between response capability and the identified threat, while maintaining the impression of normal operational activity. This is the choreography of modern tactical response. It is not spontaneous. It is not improvised, at least not entirely. It draws on doctrine, on rehearsed procedures, on the institutional memory of how to approach these situations in a way that maximizes the advantage held by the side with information while minimizing the risk to the people being asked to act on that information. The helicopter crew is now effectively the center of a developing operation. They are the link between the command element and the ground reality. They are relaying updates, reporting changes in activity at the position, watching for any sign that the situation is developing in a direction that changes the operational picture. They are, in the language of modern military operations, providing persistent surveillance of a high-value point of interest. And every minute that passes, the response capability gets closer, the options narrow, the moment approaches. The tell that breaks it open, and then something happens at the position. It might be small, a figure moving between pieces of cover, a piece of equipment being repositioned, a vehicle previously invisible under the canopy shifting slightly, a communications antenna being raised, a muzzle briefly visible where before there was only shadow and vegetation. It might be any of these things. It might be something else entirely, something specific to this situation, this terrain, this moment. But whatever it is, it confirms what the helicopter crew already suspected. This position is not empty. It is not a decoy. It is not an old fighting position from a previous engagement, long abandoned and cold. It is occupied, it is active, and it is now doing something that suggests awareness of the developing situation. That confirmation changes everything, because now the element of uncertainty is reduced. The command element no longer has to operate on probability. They are operating on confirmed observation. The decision pathway simplifies, not because the decision becomes easy, it never does, but because the informational basis for the decision is now solid. The position is real, it is there, it is occupied, it is active. And the response that has been building is now authorized to execute. What happens next? The specifics of what follows in a real engagement of this type are shaped by factors that vary enormously from situation to situation. The rules of engagement in effect, the nature of the threat, the proximity of noncombatants, the available response options, whether the situation calls for capture, neutralization, withdrawal of the threat, or something else entirely. But there are patterns, there are doctrinal approaches that shape how these situations resolve. And understanding those patterns helps make sense of why the helicopter's role does not end at observation, why the crew that spotted the position often ends up being a central element of the response that follows. In many operational contexts, the helicopter is not just an observer, it is also a potential responder. Armed rotary wing aircraft carry weapons specifically designed for exactly this kind of engagement. The ability to transition from observation to direct action, or to provide supporting fire for a ground element moving on the position, is part of what makes aerial assets so tactically valuable in these situations. They can see what others cannot. And in some cases, they can act on what they see without waiting for a ground force to close the distance. In other contexts, the helicopter's role is to hold, to maintain eyes on, to keep the situation stable and observed while a ground force maneuvers into position, to make sure the position cannot relocate without being tracked, to prevent the advantage of information from slipping away in the time it takes for other elements to arrive. And in still other contexts, the helicopter becomes the communications link, the eyes and voice of a commander trying to manage a rapidly developing situation from a distance. Relaying information, updating the ground picture in real time, calling out changes, alerting responding elements to what they are moving into. These roles are not mutually exclusive. In a developing engagement of this type, an experienced crew may find themselves shifting between all three within the space of a few minutes. Observer, communicator, responder, and always the constant background calculation of fuel state, weapon state, crew endurance, and whether the situation requires something this crew can provide or something that needs to come from elsewhere. The weight of the moment? There is something important to say here about what these moments feel like for the people inside them. And it is something that gets lost in the tactical language, in the grids and the assets and the decision cycles. Because behind all of that technical machinery are human beings doing one of the most demanding things a human being can do. Operating under extreme uncertainty, with extreme consequences attached to every decision in real time with no ability to pause, rewind, or reconsider after the fact. The helicopter crew that spotted this position went from routine observation to the center of a developing tactical situation in a matter of seconds. There was no warning. There was no gradual escalation that gave them time to mentally prepare. One moment they were scanning terrain they had scanned many times before. The next moment they had found something that changed the operational reality of their entire area. And in the middle of that transition, they had to function. They had to communicate clearly and calmly. They had to manage their aircraft. They had to maintain observation. They had to control their own reactions and focus entirely on the task in front of them. This is what training produces, not the absence of a stress response, but the ability to function through it, to let the training take over when the situation demands it. To fall back on rehearsed procedures and drilled behaviors when the natural human response to danger would otherwise interfere with what needs to happen. The crew who find these positions are not superhuman. They are not free of the normal human experience of fear, of uncertainty, of the weight of knowing that what they do in the next few minutes has real consequences for real people. They carry all of that, but they carry it while doing the job. And the job in this moment is to hold the picture, keep eyes on, report accurately, and be ready for whatever comes next. When the position responds, now we come to the part of this story that defines it as something beyond a routine observation mission, because the position did not stay quiet. The people inside made a decision. They had their own training, their own protocols, their own assessment of the situation, and their assessment led them to act. The specifics of how a concealed position responds to aerial observation vary enormously based on the nature of the force, the rules of engagement they are operating under, the tactical situation they are part of, and the orders they have received from their own command element. Some positions are ordered to maintain concealment at all costs, to absorb observation without responding, to trust that they have not been detected even when the evidence suggests otherwise. Others are given authority to respond to threats. Others are positioned specifically as part of an ambush, waiting for an aerial or ground element to enter a specific kill zone before acting. Whatever the specific orders this position was operating under, the decision was made to act. And action from a hidden position in a contested environment is the moment when everything accelerates to a pace that the human mind struggles to fully process in real time. This is the threshold. This is the moment when an observation mission becomes something else. When the helicopter crew went from being observers to being part of an engagement, the dynamic changes in a fundamental way. The rules change, the options change, the tempo changes. And the crew, trained for exactly this, responds. The response under fire. A helicopter crew that comes under effective fire in a confined airspace over terrain like this is dealing with a problem set that has very few good options and requires immediate, correct decision-making. They cannot simply accelerate away in any direction. Terrain, altitude, other aircraft, and the nature of the threat all constrain their movement options. They need to move, but they need to move correctly. They need to create distance from the threat while maintaining situational awareness, maintaining communication with the command element, and if they are in a position to do so, responding to the threat. The response to fire from a concealed position follows doctrine. But doctrine applied in real time by real people under real fire is never as clean as it looks on a training range or in a classroom. The noise is real. The urgency is real. The consequences of error are real. And the crew is managing all of that while simultaneously flying an aircraft, which remains regardless of everything else happening around them, a machine that requires continuous attention and inputs to remain aloft. This is why crew coordination in rotary wing aviation under fire is one of the most demanding skills in military aviation. Not because the individual tasks are uniquely difficult in isolation, but because all of them must happen simultaneously, correctly, under the worst possible conditions. The pilot is flying. The co-pilot or second crew member is managing communications and weapons systems if applicable. The crew chief is maintaining observation, providing situational awareness to the pilots, and managing their own defensive responsibilities. All of this at the same time, all of it under stress that most people will never experience and cannot fully imagine. And they are doing it because the mission requires it. Because the people on the ground, whether a ground force moving toward that position or other aircraft in the area or the command element trying to manage the situation, all of them depend on this crew maintaining function, staying in the fight, doing the job. What the ground force sees. If there is a ground force in the area, their perspective on this moment is completely different from the helicopter crews. They are hearing the engagement over the radio. They are getting real-time updates, imperfect, fragmentary, colored by the stress and urgency of the moment, but real. And they are making their own calculations. How far away is the position? What route gets us there and maintains our own cover? What does our approach need to look like to avoid becoming the next thing that position engages? Ground forces moving toward an engagement involving a helicopter already in contact are operating under a specific kind of pressure. The helicopter is there. The helicopter might need support. The helicopter might be in trouble. And everything a ground force knows about the camaraderie of combat operations, the pull to move toward your people when your people are in contact, pulls them toward faster movement. But faster movement in this terrain against this kind of threat can mean moving into the exact situation the position was designed to create. So the ground force leader has to hold both things at once. The urgency of the situation and the discipline required not to let that urgency override tactical judgment, to move quickly but correctly, to close the distance in a way that maintains the ground force's own survivability while contributing to resolving the engagement. This is command under pressure, and it is happening at the ground level, at the individual small unit level, at the same moment the helicopter crew is managing their situation in the air. Multiple people, multiple elements, all making critical decisions simultaneously, all connected by a radio net that is itself under the stress of the situation. Traffic stepping on traffic, urgent reports competing for the same frequency, the raw noise of a developing engagement cutting through everything. This is what combat actually sounds like, not the clean, sequenced narrative of an after-action briefing. The actual sound and feel of it is simultaneous, overlapping, loud, and relentlessly fast. The position makes its last calculation. Inside the hidden position, the decision to engage had consequences the people there could not fully predict. Because engaging an aerial asset in a contested environment is not a decision made in isolation. It has immediate effects that ripple outward faster than any ground force can move. Radar systems pick up the engagement. Signals intelligence captures the communications. Other aerial assets in the area update their picture. The command element reacts, and the response, which was already building before the first shot was fired, accelerates. A hidden position that remains hidden holds a form of power. It can observe, it can report, it can wait for the right moment to act, it can shape the battlefield in ways that are invisible to the other side. The moment that position fires, all of that power converts into a different kind of transaction. Now it is a target. Now it is located with far greater precision than it was before. Now the concealment that was its greatest asset has been partly surrendered by the act of firing. Because muzzle flash, sound, and the direction of incoming fire all provide data points that the aerial crew and the command element use immediately to refine their picture of exactly where the threat is. The hidden position has, in the act of responding, given up information that it cannot get back. And the response, the full response with all of its assets and coordination, is now converging. What happens in these moments? Let us slow this down. Because the few seconds to few minutes that define the resolution of an engagement like this are worth understanding in detail, because they represent some of the most complex, high-stakes human activity that occurs in the modern world. The helicopter crew, if armed, is making targeting decisions at the speed of the engagement. Positive identification, rules of engagement, weapon selection, aim point, clearing the airspace, communicating the intention and the execution simultaneously, all of it happening in a timeframe measured in seconds. If the crew is unarmed, or if the nature of the engagement puts direct action beyond their capability or authority in this moment, they are calling in that action, describing the target precisely, providing updated grid coordinates, reporting the activity at the position, guiding other assets toward it while managing their own survival in the airspace. Ground forces are moving. They are receiving real-time updates over the radio. They are adjusting their approach to account for what the helicopter is reporting. They are managing their own formations, their own pace, their own readiness to transition from movement to contact when they arrive. The command element is tracking all of this simultaneously, making decisions about resource allocation, approving or modifying courses of action, managing the broader operational picture to make sure that the response to this specific position does not create a vulnerability somewhere else in the area. And through all of it, the helicopter crew stays in the fight, because the moment aerial observation is lost, the ground picture goes dark, and nobody can afford that. The resolution: every engagement like this resolves one way or another. The position is neutralized by direct action from aerial or ground assets. The position is abandoned by its occupants, who withdraw under the pressure of the response. The ground force arrives and clears the position in a direct engagement, or the situation develops in a direction that requires a different kind of resolution entirely. What the resolution looks like in this specific case is the product of every decision made by every person on both sides of this engagement, from the moment the helicopter crew made their initial observation to the moment the shooting stops and the situation is assessed. But regardless of the specific outcome, certain things remain true about what happened here. A helicopter crew operating with discipline and skill made an observation that changed the operational picture. They reported it correctly and quickly. They maintained their observation under difficult and then dangerous conditions. They provided the information that enabled a coordinated response. and they stayed in the fight when the fight came to them. That is what aerial observation in a contested environment actually looks like. Not the clean version. Not the version where the technology does all the work and the people just watch it happen. The version where human beings in a noisy, hot, dangerous aircraft over difficult terrain make the observations and decisions that shape outcomes for everyone else involved. The aftermath, after the engagement, after the smoke and the noise and the urgency, comes the process of understanding what happened and what it means. The position is assessed. The intelligence that was embedded in that position, documents, equipment, communications, gear, maps, anything that tells the story of who built it, what it was designed to do, and how it connects to the larger operational picture, all of that becomes extremely valuable. Because one hidden position is a data point. What it contained, what it was covering, what routes led to and from it, what it was communicating with, all of those details are pieces of a larger puzzle. And the intelligence gathered from a compromised and cleared position can reveal things about the overall operational design that were not previously understood. This is why the work does not end when the shooting stops. It continues in the careful, methodical process of exploitation, of extracting every piece of information that the position contains, of mapping it against everything else that is known, of building the picture that helps explain not just this position but the framework that it was part of. And somewhere in that process, the decision that started everything, the decision of the helicopter crew to look more closely, to trust what they saw, to report it and stay on station, that decision connects to intelligence that shapes what happens next, tomorrow, next week, in the next phase of the operation. The ripple effects of one correct observation extend further than anyone in the moment can fully see. That is true of this engagement. It is true of most engagements. The single good decision made under pressure in the right direction with the right follow-through has consequences that cannot be fully traced. The crew, let us come back to the crew, because this story is about an event, but events are made of people, and the people in that helicopter are worth understanding. Military aviation in a contested environment selects for a specific kind of person, not physically, although the demands of the job are physical, not intellectually alone. Although it demands serious intellectual capability, it selects for people who can function, who can hold technical competence and situational awareness and interpersonal coordination and personal discipline and clear communication and sound judgment all simultaneously, under the worst possible conditions, for sustained periods, without adequate sleep, without full information, without certainty. These are people who chose this, who went through training programs that wash out a significant percentage of candidates, not because the candidates lack talent, but because the specific combination of capabilities required is not common, who flew hundreds of hours before they were trusted with a mission like this one, who rehearsed exactly these scenarios, not this specific engagement, but the patterns, the procedures, the decision frameworks that this specific engagement would require. When the crew chief leaned forward and called out that shape in the trees, he was not just doing something instinctive. He was applying years of trained pattern recognition. He was using a skill set that was built deliberately, systematically, through repetition and feedback and real experience. He was being exactly the person the mission required him to be. And the pilot who adjusted without overcorrecting, who made the gradual arc that looked natural from the ground rather than the abrupt turn that would have announced the observation, was doing the same thing. Applying training, applying experience, making the right call in the right way at the right moment. That is what professional military aviation produces at its best. People who can do that, who do that reliably, consistently, across the full range of conditions that real operations produce. There are lessons in this story that go beyond the tactical, beyond the specific mechanics of how a hidden position gets detected and how the response unfolds. There are lessons about the nature of observation, about the limits of concealment, about the relationship between technology and human judgment, and about what it means to be part of a system that depends on every element doing its part precisely. The first lesson is that concealment is never absolute. No matter how carefully a position is built, no matter how thorough the camouflage, no matter how much attention has been paid to defeating aerial observation specifically, there's always something. A tell, a shadow, a line, a pattern. And if the observer is experienced enough and paying close enough attention, that something gets found. The people who built this position understood that perfectly. They built against it as hard as they could. And they still got found. Because concealment degrades over time, because nature is imperfect, because no matter how disciplined the occupants of a position are, human beings in a confined space over an extended period inevitably leave traces. And experienced aerial observers are looking for traces. The second lesson is about the compounding value of information. The initial observation by the helicopter crew was one data point. By itself, it was significant. In combination with what was found at the position after its resolution, in combination with patterns observed in other areas, in combination with signals intelligence and human intelligence and other sources, it became part of something much larger. Information is rarely valuable in isolation. Its value compounds when it connects to other information, when it fills gaps, when it confirms hypotheses or refutes them, when it contributes to a picture that is larger than any single observation can produce. The third lesson is about the importance of staying in the fight even when staying is hard. The helicopter crew had every human reason to create distance from a position that was now firing at them. And instead they stayed on station, maintained observation, and continued to provide the information and coordination that the response depended on. That decision, to stay when leaving would have been easier and perhaps felt safer, made the resolution possible. There are many moments in military operations where the single most important thing a person can do is continue to do the thing they were already doing under conditions that make it enormously difficult. This crew demonstrated that. The fourth lesson is about the relationship between individual decision-making and collective outcome. No single person made this happen. The crew chief who spotted the tell, the pilot who adjusted correctly, the crew that maintained observation, the command element that processed the information and coordinated the response, the ground force that moved on the position, the intelligence personnel who exploited it afterward, all of them contributed. All of their individual decisions made independently in their own specific contexts combined to produce an outcome. Remove any one of them from the sequence and the outcome changes. That is the nature of complex military operations. They are collective achievements built from individual correct decisions. What this story means? Stories like this one matter for a reason that goes beyond the tactical interest of following an engagement from observation to resolution. They matter because they make visible something that is usually invisible: the sustained, professional, dangerous work of the men and women who conduct these operations every day. Most people never see this. They see the news report if there is one, they hear a number, an operation was conducted, a position was cleared, the situation in the area has developed. All of that language is accurate and also completely opaque. It does not convey the helicopter banking over the tree line, the crew chief with his eyes locked on something that should not be there, the pause before he called it out, the long seconds of the second pass, the radio call going up the chain. The response beginning to build, the position firing, the crew staying on station, the ground force moving, the resolution. That is what the number refers to, that is what the language is summarizing. And the only way to understand what it actually costs, what it actually takes, who actually does it, is to go into the story in the detail that it deserves. The crew of that helicopter was not thinking about how the story would be told afterward. They were thinking about the mission, about the position, about the picture they were carrying for every other element that was depending on them, about staying on station, about doing the job. That is what professionalism looks like when it is actually tested. Not in the moment when it is easy, but in the moment when it is the hardest thing imaginable. When every human instinct is pulling in one direction and the mission is pulling in the other. And the person, or the crew, chooses the mission. Every time. The broader picture? Zoom out for a moment. Because this engagement, this specific helicopter, this specific position, this specific moment in this specific operational area did not exist in isolation. It was one element of a much larger operational context. A context shaped by decisions made at levels far above the crew in that helicopter. Decisions about strategy, about objectives, about rules of engagement, about which areas were being actively patrolled and why, about what the overall operational design required from every element contributing to it. The crew did not need to understand all of that context to do their job. They needed to understand their specific mission, their specific area, their specific rules of engagement, and their specific relationship to the command element that was coordinating the overall effort. But the fact that they did their job correctly, that their single correct observation and their sustained professional response contributed to the larger operational objective, is precisely how strategy connects to reality. Not through grand decisions alone, but through the accumulated correct decisions of every element doing its part at the level where it operates. Strategy is not abstract. It is the sum of what happens at exactly this level: the crew chief who spots something, the pilot who adjusts correctly, the crew that stays on station. These are the people through whom strategic objectives become operational reality. And without them, without the professional human judgment at the level of the individual and the small team, no strategy reaches its objectives regardless of how sound it is at the conceptual level. This is a truth about military operations that does not get discussed as often as it should. The technology matters, the intelligence matters, the strategic design matters. But what ultimately determines whether any of it produces results is whether the person in the helicopter, in the position on the ground, in the command vehicle, does their job correctly at the moment it matters. And in this story, they did. The tradition, what happened here, connects to something much older than the helicopters and the communication systems and the precision targeting that define modern military aviation. It connects to a tradition that goes back to the first time a person climbed to a high point to look at what was happening below, to the observer in the tree who spotted the enemy column, to the balloon observer in the Civil War, rising above the battlefield to see what no one on the ground could see, to the early aviators of the First World War who began by flying observation missions and discovered that what they could see from the air changed the nature of warfare itself. Aerial observation in all of its forms throughout history represents the human desire to see more than the ground allows, to understand the battlefield more completely, to hold information that the other side does not have. It is not a passive capability. In the hands of trained, experienced, disciplined people, it is one of the most potent tools that any military force can bring to an operational environment. Because information, timely, accurate, actionable information, wins fights. Sometimes it wins them before a single round is fired, because the side